The last normal thing I ever did was burn toast. I remember standing in the kitchen at 6:14 in the morning, watching smoke curl from the top of the toaster, thinking about how Marcus would have made a joke about it. Something dry. Something about how I could survive 2 tours in Afghanistan, but couldn't handle a 4-slot Cuisinart. He had that kind of humor, the kind that made you feel stupid and loved at the same time. But Marcus wasn't there. Marcus hadn't been there since sometime around midnight. And that fact, a fact I'd shoved to the back of my skull for 6 hours, was starting to press against the walls of something I couldn't name yet. Not panic, not quite. More like the feeling you get when you realize you left the stove on, but you're already 40 miles down the highway. Let me back up. My brother Marcus was 34, 3 years older than me. He ran a small logistics company out of Granton, Missouri, population 11,000 and shrinking. Trucking routes, warehouse coordination, some light freight consulting, nothing glamorous. But he was good at it, obsessively good, the way he was good at anything that required planning and order. His desk was cleaner than a surgical tray. His trucks ran on time. He returned every call within the hour, which is why it mattered that he hadn't returned mine. I'd driven down from St. Louis the previous afternoon to help him clear out our mother's house. She'd been dead 4 months, pancreatic. Fast, the way she would have wanted, and we'd been putting off the sorting of her things the way you put off anything that makes grief feel administrative. I'd arrived around 3. We'd done 2 hours of boxing up kitchen supplies and old paperwork, and then Marcus had said he needed to run an errand. One errand, 30 minutes, tops. That was at 6:15 p.m. By 8, I'd called twice. By 10, 4 more times. By midnight, I was sitting on our dead mother's porch, with a beer I wasn't really drinking, staring at the gravel driveway and telling myself there was a reasonable explanation. Car trouble, a detour, a woman he hadn't told me about. Marcus was private. Marcus kept compartments. That was his architecture, neat boxes, sealed lids, everything in its labeled place. But he always answered the phone. I went to bed at 1 a.m. in our mother's guest room, on a mattress that smelled like lavender sachets and old dust. And I didn't sleep, not really. I drifted through that shallow territory where your body rests, but your mind paces. Every set of headlights that swept across the ceiling made me hold my breath. None of them stopped. So by the time I was burning toast at 6:14, I was already running a quiet calculus in my head, the kind of math you do when you're not ready to say the word missing, but you're already measuring the distance to the police station. I scraped the toast, dropped it in the trash, and picked up my phone to try his number again. That's when the emergency alert hit. The screen lit up with that ugly, vibrating block of text, the kind you get for flash floods and amber alerts. But this one was different. The header read, Civil Emergency Granton County and surrounding areas. And the body of the message contained 2 sentences that didn't make sense. Not because the words were complicated, but because the reality they described hadn't existed 5 seconds earlier. Reports of aggressive and abnormal behavior in multiple locations. Residents are advised to shelter in place immediately. Do not approach affected individuals. I read it twice. Then I looked out the kitchen window and saw Mrs. Landry from across the road, standing at the end of her driveway in her nightgown. She was facing the street, completely still, her arms at her sides. It was 41 degrees out. Her feet were bare. I watched her for 10 seconds, maybe 15. She didn't move, didn't shift her weight, didn't wrap her arms around herself against the cold. She just stood there, like a post driven into soil. Then she turned her head, not her body, just her head, and looked directly at the window where I was standing. I stepped back. I don't know what I saw in her face. I've tried to reconstruct it 100 times since. It wasn't rage. It wasn't blankness. It was something between recognition and hunger, like she could see me, but the part of her that knew what seeing meant had been replaced by something leaner and older and worse. The phone was still in my hand. I looked at the screen. No response from Marcus. No missed calls. No texts. 6 hours. He'd been gone 6 hours before the world changed its rules. I grabbed my jacket and my keys and walked out the back door. The streets of Granton were wrong in a way that didn't announce itself. That was the cruelest part of those first minutes, how ordinary the apocalypse looked when it was still wearing its disguise. The houses sat in their rows. The trees were bare and dripping with last night's rain. A dog barked somewhere to the south, rhythmic and unanswered. If you'd taken a photograph, you could have sold it as Small Town America, Winter Edition. But the sound was off. That's what I noticed first. Granton at 6:30 in the morning should have had engine noise trucks warming up at the grain elevator, the early shift heading to the plastics plant on Route 9. Instead, the only mechanical sound was a car alarm pulsing 3 streets over, and underneath it, a thin, sourceless hum that I later learned was the combined moan of several dozen infected people standing motionless in the parking lot of the Granton IGA, a quarter-mile east of where I was driving. I didn't know that yet. I didn't know anything yet. All I knew was that my brother was missing, and my phone was showing 6 unread emergency alerts, each one slightly more urgent than the last. And the radio in our mother's old Subaru was playing the emergency broadcast tone on every station. I drove to Marcus's apartment first. It was a clean 2-bedroom above a hardware store on Main. The kind of place that looks temporary, but that he'd lived in for 7 years. I still had a key. I took the stairs 2 at a time and opened the door to an apartment that was exactly as organized as I expected. Dishes washed, bed made, laptop closed on the desk. His overnight bag was on the floor by the closet, packed, zipped, ready, as if he'd planned to come back and grab it. But his phone charger was still plugged into the wall, and Marcus never went anywhere without a full battery. It was a tic of his, a discipline left over from the years he spent driving long haul before starting the business. Battery, fuel, water, his holy trinity. I stood in the apartment and forced myself to think like him. Where would Marcus go at 6:15 on a Thursday evening that would keep him out all night? Not a bar he'd been sober 9 years. Not a woman's house he'd been divorced for 3 and hadn't dated since. Not seriously. Not work. His warehouse was locked on a timer, and I had the security app on my phone. No entries logged since 4 p.m. the previous day. 1 errand, he'd said. 30 minutes. I opened his laptop. No password. He used a fingerprint reader and had left it in sleep mode. His browser showed 3 tabs. The first was a weather radar. The second was a diesel price tracker. The third was a map. The map was zoomed in on a location about 22 miles northwest of Granton. Deep in the unincorporated stretch of Harlan County, where the farmland gives way to woods and the roads turn to gravel, and then to dirt, and then to nothing. I'd grown up in this area. I knew most of it. But the pin on Marcus's map was dropped in a place I didn't recognize, a small clearing off an unmarked road that, according to the satellite image, contained a structure. Rectangular, industrial, no label, no address, no business listing. I screenshot the coordinates and sent them to my own phone. When I turned to leave, I glanced out the window overlooking Main Street and saw something that rearranged the urgency in my chest. 2 people were walking down the center of the road, not on the sidewalk. Down the middle, in the lane, moving with that stilted, oddly fluid gait that I would come to know as the walk, the unmistakable locomotion of someone whose nervous system had been restructured by whatever this infection was. Their clothes were soaked. One of them was missing a shoe. Neither of them looked cold. A third figure appeared from behind the post office and joined them, matching their speed, their direction, their silence. I left through the back and got into the Subaru and pulled out of the alley with my headlights off. The radio had stopped playing the emergency broadcast tone. Now it was just static on every frequency, and somewhere beneath it, a voice-clipped military cadence repeating a single instruction. Do not travel north on Route 9. Do not approach the quarantine perimeter. Remain sheltered. North on Route 9 was exactly where Marcus's map pin was pointing. I turned north. The first 7 miles were almost peaceful. The road was empty. The sky was that heavy Missouri gray that looks like a ceiling dropped too low. And the fields on either side were stubbled with last year's corn, pale and broken and glazed with frost. I drove at 60, then 50, then 40 as the road narrowed and the pavement deteriorated. The Subaru rattled over patches and cracks that hadn't been filled in years. At mile 8, I passed the first checkpoint, or what had been a checkpoint. 2 county sheriff vehicles were parked diagonally across the road, lights still flashing, but no one was inside either car. The driver's door of the nearest one was open, and the radio inside was squawking with overlapping voices, frantic, fragmented, none of them finishing a sentence. I eased around the blockade through the ditch and kept going. At mile 12, the signal on my phone died. Not a gradual weakening, a clean cutoff, as if something had drawn a line across the landscape and said, nothing past here. I pulled over and tried restarting it. The phone came back, showed 1 bar for 3 seconds, then dropped to nothing. I took a breath and kept driving. The turnoff for the unmarked road came at mile 19. I almost missed it. It was little more than a gap in the tree line, where the gravel shoulder widened slightly, and 2 faded tire tracks disappeared into the woods. But the tracks were fresh. The mud was churned. And 20 feet down the trail, caught on a low branch, was a strip of yellow reflective tape, the same kind Marcus used on the tie-down straps for his flatbed trucks. I turned onto the track and drove slowly, branches scraping the roof and sides of the Subaru. The undercarriage grinding over ruts that had been carved by something heavier than a car. The trees were dense oak and hickory mostly, bare and interlocking above me like a cage made of bone. The light was thin. The air that came through the vents smelled like wet earth and something metallic I couldn't place. After roughly 1.5 miles, the trees opened into a clearing. And there was Marcus's truck, the blue F250 with the white toolbox in the bed, the dent in the rear quarter panel from when he'd backed into a loading dock in Joplin, the Chantarantsausy Harlan County Logistics decal peeling on the driver's door. It was parked at an angle, nose facing a structure I'd never seen before in a place that, according to every map I'd ever consulted, contained nothing. The structure was concrete, low, rectangular, about the size of a small warehouse or a large equipment shed. It had no windows. Its walls were smooth and stained with water streaks and what looked like decades of weather. A single metal door was set into the near side, painted industrial gray, standing half open. There was no signage, no fencing, no power lines running to or from it. It looked like something that had been built in a hurry, used for a purpose, and then abandoned so completely that the land had started to forget it. Except someone hadn't forgotten. The clearing around the building had been recently maintained, the grass was short, the brush cut back, and a gravel apron extended from the door to where Marcus's truck was parked. Fresh tire tracks other than his were visible in the mud, multiple vehicles, recent. I parked behind the F250 and got out. The silence here was different from the silence in town. Town silence was the absence of expected noise. This silence was architectural. It felt designed, as if the clearing had been carved specifically to muffle sound. The trees absorbed everything. Even my footsteps on the gravel seemed to die a foot from my boots. I checked Marcus's truck. Unlocked. Keys in the ignition. His phone was on the passenger seat, dead, battery at 0. His jacket was folded on the back seat. The toolbox in the bed was open and empty, though it normally held tie-downs, a first aid kit, and a flashlight. I took the flashlight he'd left it on the ground beside the truck, and I walked to the door. The metal was cold. The gap was about 14 inches wide. Through it, I could see a concrete floor, a set of stairs going down, and a faint amber light coming from below. I said his name. Once. Quietly. The sound went down the stairs and didn't come back. The stairs went down 18 steps. I counted them because counting gave me something to do with the part of my brain that wanted to turn around. The walls were poured concrete, unpainted, smooth, except for a series of metal conduits bolted to the ceiling that carried wiring toward the amber light below. The air temperature dropped with each step, not the cool of a basement, but the cold of deep earth, the kind of cold that has weight and patience. At the bottom, the stairwell opened into a corridor, 8 feet wide, fluorescent fixtures on the ceiling, half of them dead, the others buzzing with a low, irregular flicker that made the light feel alive in an unpleasant way. The floor was polished concrete, clean, marked with black scuff lines from heavy equipment. The walls were lined with metal doors, 6 on each side. Each one fitted with a small observation window made of thick glass or acrylic. The kind you see in hospital psychiatric wards. This was not an equipment shed. This was not a storage facility. This was something that had been built underground, deliberately concealed and maintained by someone with resources and purpose. I walked to the first door on the left and looked through the window. The room beyond was small, 10 by 10, maybe and bare except for a metal cot bolted to the floor and a drain in the center. The walls were white. The cot was stripped. On the floor beside it was a plastic water bottle, empty, and a dark stain that could have been anything but that my gut told me was blood. The second room was identical. The third had its cot overturned. The fourth had scratch marks on the inside of the door, deep, frantic, layered, and something smeared across the observation window that I didn't look at closely enough to identify. I moved faster down the corridor, checking each window. The rooms on the right side were all the same, small, bare, stained, empty. But the last door on the left was different. It was open. Not half open like the exterior door, fully open. The heavy metal swung back against the wall as if someone had thrown it wide in a hurry. Inside, the room was larger than the others. It had been set up as a kind of office or monitoring station. A metal desk held 2 flat-screen monitors, both dark. A filing cabinet stood against the wall, its drawers pulled out and emptied. Papers were scattered across the floor, printouts, charts, photographs. And on the desk, held in place by a coffee mug that was still half full and cold, was a handwritten note on yellow legal paper. I recognized Marcus's handwriting immediately. The tight, upright letters. The habit of pressing too hard with the pen. It read, Nora. I pulled the drives. Building B is open. If I'm not back by morning, it means I went to the secondary site. Do not go alone. Bring Cal. Cal. That was me. I read it again. Then a third time, because the implications were stacking up faster than I could process them. Marcus had been here. Marcus had known about this place. Marcus had pulled hard drives from these monitors, which meant he knew what was stored on them. Marcus knew someone named Nora, and Marcus had anticipated the possibility that he wouldn't come back, which meant he understood, at least partially, the danger of whatever this place was. My brother had been keeping a secret, not a small one, not a private relationship or a financial problem. A secret with an underground facility, observation rooms, blood on the floor, and a name I'd never heard him mention. I gathered every loose paper I could find and stuffed them into my jacket. Then I searched the rest of the room. In the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, behind a hanging folder, I found a laminated ID badge. The photo showed a woman mid-40s, dark hair pulled back, sharp features. The name read Dr. Nora Kessler. The organization listed below was abbreviated. GRNT-7 Applied Research. There was no logo, no government seal, no corporate branding. Just the name and a barcode. Nora. I pocketed the badge and went back into the corridor. At the far end, past the last doors, was a second stairwell, this one going deeper. The amber light was stronger here, warmer, and it carried with it a sound I hadn't noticed before. A low, rhythmic thumping. Not mechanical, biological, like a heartbeat amplified through stone. I was 3 steps down when I heard movement above me. Not footsteps, something heavier, wetter, a dragging sound mixed with a clicking that came from the throat. It was behind me, at the far end of the corridor, near the stairs I'd come down. I turned and pointed the flashlight. The beam caught a figure standing in the corridor entrance. Human-shaped, upright, male, from the build. He was wearing a hospital gown, pale blue, open at the back, and his bare feet were black with grime. His head was tilted at an angle that no comfortable neck would allow. And his eyes, when the light found them, were open and wet and utterly vacant. He didn't react to the light. He didn't blink. But his mouth opened, slowly, and the clicking sound came again, so a rapid, insectile rhythm produced somewhere deep in his larynx, as if the muscles of his throat were contracting involuntarily against something lodged inside. I'd seen the infected in town from a distance. This was my first time within 20 feet of one. He took a step forward. Not fast, not aggressive. Exploratory, the way you'd step onto ice you weren't sure about. But the step had direction. It had intent. It was aimed at me. I backed down the second stairwell without turning around, keeping the flashlight on him, counting the steps again because counting was the only thing keeping my breathing under control. He didn't follow. He stood at the top of the stairs and clicked, and clicked, and clicked, until I rounded a turn in the stairwell, and the sound finally faded. The second level down was different. The corridor here was wider, the ceiling higher, and the fluorescent lights had been replaced by emergency strips that cast a dull red glow across everything. The thumping sound was louder. Not a heartbeat, I realize now, but a generator. Somewhere ahead, a diesel generator was running on autopilot, keeping this lower level powered while the world above it disintegrated. The corridor opened into a large room that I can only describe as a laboratory, though the word feels too clean for what I found. 3 rows of stainless steel tables ran the length of the space, each one bolted to the floor. Most were bare. 2 held equipment I recognized from my time as an Army medic: centrifuges, microscope stages, refrigerated sample cases, and 1 held something I did not recognize. A glass containment unit, about 4 feet long, sealed with silicon gaskets and fitted with a series of tubes that ran to a pump on the floor. The pump was still cycling. Whatever had been inside the glass was gone. The tubes were stained with a residue that was dark brown at the edges and almost black at the center. Along the far wall, a row of industrial refrigerators stood humming. I opened the first. Inside, on labeled racks, were hundreds of small vials of glass, sealed, each one containing a fluid that ranged in color from pale amber to deep, oily red. The labels were coded alphanumeric strings that meant nothing to me, but the dates were legible. The earliest was from 4 years ago. The most recent was from 6 days before. This facility had been active, recently active. Whatever had been happening here, testing, development, containment, it had been ongoing when Marcus walked through that door. I closed the refrigerator and moved to the far end of the lab, where another door stood half open. This one led to a smaller room that looked like a break area converted into a crisis center. A whiteboard on the wall was covered in handwriting of multiple colors, multiple hands depicting a timeline. The entries were technical, abbreviated, but certain phrases were circled in red and underlined. Vector mutation confirmed November 14th. Containment protocol failed, building C subjects breached. Airborne potential inconclusive. Direct fluid transfer confirmed. Kessler recommends full shutdown. Overruled November 19th. November 19th. 3 weeks ago. Beneath the timeline, in black marker and different handwriting, looser, angrier, someone had added. They're not shutting it down. They're accelerating it. And below that, in Marcus's unmistakable hand, Nora says secondary site has the full archive. I can get there. I stared at those words and felt the ground shift beneath me, not literally, but in that deeper, tectonic way that happens when you realize the person you thought you knew best in the world has been living a life you couldn't have imagined. Marcus wasn't here by accident. He wasn't a bystander who stumbled onto something. He was involved, possibly for years. He knew Nora Kessler. He knew about this facility, about the research, about the containment failures. He'd come here on the night the outbreak began, 6 hours before it broke the surface, to pull hard drives and get to a secondary site. The question was whether he'd gone there to stop what was happening or to finish it. I didn't want to ask that question. I physically felt myself resist it, the way you resist touching a wound. But the evidence was in my jacket, the papers, the badge, the timeline. And the question was already forming whether I gave it permission or not. I was still standing in the converted break room when I heard the exterior door, the one at the top of the first stairwell, slam shut with a sound like a gunshot. Then, footsteps. Multiple. Moving fast, coming down. I killed the flashlight and pressed myself against the wall behind the door. The footsteps reached the first corridor, paused, continued. Whoever they were, they knew the layout. They moved without hesitation, without the careful counting I'd needed. They came down the second stairwell and into the lab, and I heard a voice, female, low, controlled, breathing hard but not panicking. He took the drives. Both stations are wiped. A second voice, male, younger. His truck's still outside. I know. Check the cold storage. If he touched the samples, we have a much bigger problem. I held my breath. Through the crack between the door and the frame, I could see them. 2 people. The woman was tall, lean, wearing a dark canvas jacket and boots that had seen serious terrain. Her hair was pulled back, dark, streaked with gray. The man was in his 20s, broad, wearing a tactical vest over a flannel shirt, and carrying a rifle that he held like he knew what it was for. The woman turned toward the whiteboard. She read what was there. Her jaw tightened. He went to the secondary site, she said. Not a question. Then we go after him. Not yet. Not until we know what's moving up top. Jennings reported the IGA cluster hit 30 plus. The North Road might already be blocked. The man with the rifle moved toward the refrigerators. I heard him open one, rifle through the racks, close it. Samples are intact. He didn't take any. The woman exhaled, not relief exactly, but the release of one specific fear among many. She turned in a slow circle, scanning the room, and her eyes passed across the door I was behind. She stopped. "Come out," she said. "I can see your boots." I stepped out with my hands visible and the flashlight held low, and the man with the rifle had the muzzle on my chest before I'd finished the motion. His eyes were steady. His finger was outside the trigger guard. Trained, disciplined, but ready. "Who the hell are you?" he said. "Cal Mercer. Marcus is my brother." The woman's expression changed. It was subtle, a fractional widening of the eyes, a shift in the set of her mouth, but it told me two things. She knew my name, and she hadn't expected me to be here. "Cal," she said. "He told me about you. Military background, medic. And you're Nora Kessler." She looked at my jacket pocket, where the corner of the laminated badge was visible. She didn't ask how I'd found it. We don't have time for the long version. The short version is this. I'm a molecular virologist. I ran the research team here until 3 weeks ago, when funding pulled rank on science and everything went to hell. Your brother has been helping me try to expose what happened. He came here last night to pull the data archives proof of what this facility was doing and who authorized it. What was this facility doing? She held my gaze. Engineering a controllable pathogen, neurotropic, designed to suppress higher cognitive function while preserving motor coordination and basic aggression response. A weapon you could deploy and then turn off. The words sat in the air between us like something dropped from a great height. "Except you couldn't turn it off," I said. "No, we couldn't. The mutation rate exceeded every model we built. By the time the containment failure happened in Building C, the pathogen had already evolved past our kill switch. It was self-propagating, transmissible through fluid contact, and the incubation window was down to less than 6 hours. 6 hours. The same window Marcus had been gone. Is he infected? I don't know, Nora said. And I believed her because she didn't flinch or soften or look away. He was here for several hours before we lost contact. If he stayed topside and didn't engage with any breached subjects, he should be clean. But if he went to Building C before heading to the secondary site, she let the sentence decay. The man with the rifle, she called him Whelan, lowered the muzzle but didn't sling the weapon. We need to move. The cluster at the IGA was expanding when I came through. If they hit critical density, they start migrating. Migrating, I said. They move in groups once there are enough of them. Not coordinated, not intelligent, but they follow stimulus gradients, sound, heat, movement. A cluster of 30 will become a column of 100 if it hits a populated area. And a column of 100 will strip a neighborhood in an hour. Nora was already gathering items from the lab. A hard shell case from under one of the tables. A set of vials from the second refrigerator that she handled with the careful urgency of someone moving unstable ordnance. She packed them into the case and sealed it. The secondary site is a records facility, she told me, moving toward the stairwell. Decommissioned Army Corps archive, about 40 miles northwest, in the hills past the Harlan County line. Marcus and I found it 6 months ago and we were tracking the funding chain. It's where the project leadership stored their documentation, not digital. Physical. Binders, memos, signed authorizations. Proof that this wasn't a rogue operation. It went up the chain. Marcus went there alone? He wasn't supposed to. The plan was to go together, but he saw something on the lab feeds last night that spooked him. He pulled the digital drives and left. I think he was trying to get to the archive before anyone else could scrub it. Why would they scrub it now? Nora stopped at the base of the stairs and looked back at me with an expression I've thought about many times since exhaustion and fury compressed into something flat and measured and absolutely resolved. Because the outbreak isn't an accident, Cal. The containment failure was engineered. Someone on the inside triggered the breach deliberately, and the only reason to do that is if you're shutting down evidence and using the chaos as cover. Your brother figured that out before I did. We went up the first stairwell carefully. Whelan led, rifle raised, checking each door we passed. The infected man I'd seen earlier was gone. The corridor was empty. The observation rooms were still sealed. At the top of the stairs, Whelan eased the exterior door open and scanned the clearing. The daylight was brighter now, mid-morning gray, and the clearing looked exactly as I'd left it. Marcus's truck, the Subaru, the concrete building squatting in its circle of cut grass. But at the tree line, just at the edge of where the gravel met the dirt track, 3 figures stood motionless. They weren't moving. They weren't clicking. They were just watching, if watching is even the right word for what those vacant, recalibrated eyes were doing. "Don't look at them," Nora said quietly. "Don't stop. Get in your vehicle. Follow me." We took Nora's vehicles, a mud-caked Land Cruiser that had been parked behind the building where I hadn't thought to look, and I followed in the Subaru. Whelan rode with Nora. The 3 figures at the tree line didn't move as we pulled out. But in the rearview mirror, I watched them turn, all 3, simultaneously, as if they shared a single impulse, and begin walking toward the clearing. Toward Marcus's truck, toward the building, toward whatever scent or signal we'd left behind. The dirt track back to the county road was rougher than I remembered, every rut amplified by speed. Nora drove fast and decisively, swerving around washouts without braking. And I kept pace, because the alternative was being alone on a road that suddenly felt like a corridor, with the lights going out behind me. When we hit the county road, I expected to turn south, back toward Granton, back toward the main highway, back toward the infrastructure that should have been mobilizing to deal with what was happening. Instead, Nora turned north, deeper into the unincorporated territory. And I followed because she had answers and I had only questions, and the math on that exchange was simple. We drove for 20 minutes without stopping. The county road became a state route, became a farm road, became a gravel path that cut through hills thick with timber. The land here was different, steeper, more folded, the kind of terrain that hides things naturally, where hollers and draws and blind ridges make navigation an act of faith. My phone was still dead. The radio produced nothing but static. The world had contracted to the width of the road ahead and the red taillights of Nora's vehicle. She pulled over at a wide spot where a creek crossed the road through a concrete ford. The water was low. She got out, and I got out, and Whelan stayed in the vehicle, scanning the tree line with binoculars. "We need to talk about what happens when we get there," she said. Her voice was the same as before, controlled, informational, but I could hear the effort it cost her. She was running on something deeper than adrenaline. "The archive facility is underground, like the lab, larger, multiple levels. Marcus would have gone straight for the records room on the 2nd level down. If he made it there, and if the facility is still secured, he's probably still there, working through the physical files, pulling what he needs. And if the facility isn't secured, then the breach reached it before he did. and we're walking into a structure full of infected in an enclosed space with limited exits. Is there any way to know before we go in? There's a surface access point with a security camera and a hardwired phone line. If the phone is live, the facility is on its own power and likely still sealed. If it's dead, we assume worst case. I nodded. Tactical assessment, clear parameters. This I understood. There's something else, she said. And for the first time her voice shifted, not softer, but more careful, as if she were placing each word on a scale. Marcus was exposed to the lab environment for over a year. Not to the pathogen directly, he was never in the containment zones, but to the ambient biomarkers. Everyone who worked around the project carries a low-level antibody signature. It's not immunity, not exactly. But in our models, it correlated with a longer incubation window. 12 hours instead of 6, maybe more. You're telling me that if he was exposed, I might have more time. I'm telling you that if he was exposed, he might still be himself when we find him. But the window is finite, and I don't know exactly where its edge is. She held my gaze long enough for the weight of that statement to settle. One more thing, she said. You need to know that I didn't just work on this project. I designed the core pathogen. The original architecture is mine. Before the mutations, before the weaponization parameters were added by the defense contractors, it was my research into neural plasticity that made the whole thing possible. I'm not a whistleblower from the outside. I'm the person who built the thing that's destroying everything. She said it flat, the way you'd read a verdict. No self-pity, no plea for understanding. Just the fact, placed on the ground between us. Marcus knows this, I said. Marcus has known since the beginning. He found me, not the other way around. He intercepted a shipment manifest that traced back to the facility. He spent 3 months building a picture of what was happening. And when he finally confronted me, I told him everything. I didn't expect him to help me. I expected him to go to the press or the FBI or anyone. Instead, he said the same thing he always says. We fix it first, then we tell people. She almost smiled. He said you'd know the quote. It was something our father used to say, a plumber by trade. A man who believed you tighten the fitting before you explained the leak to the customer. Marcus had inherited his philosophy. I'd inherited his wrenches. Whelan rapped on the roof of the Land Cruiser. Movement on the ridge, 1/4 mile south. Group of 6, maybe 8. Moving this direction. We got back in our vehicles. The creek water splashed against the undercarriage as I drove through the ford. And in the mirror, the ridge behind us was dotted with shapes that moved with that terrible, purposeful drift, not running, not stumbling, just advancing with the patient certainty of something that didn't need to rest. The road climbed for the next 12 miles, switchbacking through oak and pine, the gravel thinning to packed dirt, and then to something barely wider than a trail. Nora drove without hesitation. She'd been here before. She knew the turns, the landmarks, the places where the edge dropped away to ravines choked with deadfall. At a fork marked by a collapsed fence post, she went left. The trail descended into a narrow valley, steep walls on both sides. Heavy canopy above, and ended at a chain-link gate set between concrete posts. The gate was closed, but unlocked, the padlock hanging open on the chain. Beyond the gate, a gravel lot held 2 vehicles. A white government surplus van with no plates, and a black SUV that I didn't recognize, but that Nora clearly did, because she stopped the Land Cruiser and sat behind the wheel for a long time before getting out. Whose is it? I asked. Garza's, she said. Whelan's face tightened. He checked the magazine in his rifle. Who is Garza? Dr. Luis Garza. He was the project's liaison to the defense contract. He's the one who pushed for weaponization. He's the one who overruled the shutdown recommendation. And he's the one who, I now believe, engineered the containment breach. He's here. He's here. She looked at the building ahead of her, a concrete bunker set into the hillside, similar in design to the first facility but larger, with 2 visible access points and a ventilation stack rising from the roof. Which means Marcus may not be alone down there. The surface access point was a metal kiosk bolted to the wall beside the main door. Nora lifted the handset, listened, nodded once. Phone is live. Facility is on its own power. So it's sealed. The perimeter is sealed, but whoever opened that padlock had an access code. The breach isn't from the outside. She punched a code into the keypad beside the door. It buzzed. The heavy metal door clicked and swung inward on hydraulic hinges, revealing another stairwell, another descent, another passage into concrete and artificial light. Whelan went first. I followed. Nora pulled the door shut behind us, and I heard the lock re-engage, sealing us in, sealing the outside out. Though the distinction between which side of the door was safer was no longer clear. The stairwell here was wider, better maintained, with painted walls and recessed lighting that actually worked. It felt more official, less improvised lab, more designed infrastructure. The stairs descended 2 full flights and opened into a corridor that branched in 3 directions. Signs on the walls indicated sections: records, laboratory, administration. Records is to the right, 2nd level down, Nora said. Lab is straight ahead. Administration is left. Marcus would go to records. If he's thinking clearly, yes. That qualifier hung in the air. We turned right and descended another half-flight to a heavy fire door marked Records Authorized Personnel Only. Whelan tried the handle. Unlocked. He opened it slowly, rifle first, and we stepped into a room that defied the assumption of an archive. I'd expected shelves, file cabinets, the quiet bureaucracy of stored paper. What I found was wreckage. The room was enormous, at least 60 feet long, 20 wide, and every surface had been torn apart. Filing cabinets lay on their sides, drawers pulled out, contents scattered across the floor, and drifts of paper that reached my ankles. Shelves had been overturned. Binders were ripped open, their contents pulled out, and sorted. Some pages stacked neatly on a central table, others crumpled and discarded. A laptop sat open on the table, connected to a portable hard drive, its screen showing a file transfer that had completed hours ago. And in the far corner, behind a barricade made of overturned filing cabinets, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall and a tire iron across his knees, was Marcus. He looked up when the flashlight found him. His eyes were bloodshot. His shirt was torn at the collar. His hands were raw, knuckles split, as if he'd been prying open metal drawers with his bare fingers for hours. But his eyes tracked. His expression changed. He recognized me. "Cal," he said. His voice was hoarse, scraped thin. "How the hell did you find me? You left your map open on your laptop, you idiot." He closed his eyes. A sound came out of him that might have been a laugh, if it had any air in it. Then Nora stepped into the light, and his expression shifted relief, then concern, then something harder. "Garza's here," he said. "He came in about 2 hours ago. He went to the lab. He's not alone." Marcus had built his barricade not to protect himself from the infected, but from something more calculated. He told us this while he ate a protein bar that Whelan handed him, speaking between bites with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd been rationing energy for hours. He'd arrived at the archive facility just after midnight. The gate had been locked. He'd used the access code Nora had given him weeks earlier, driven in, and descended to the records room alone. The work was enormous, hundreds of binders, thousands of memos, the full paper trail of a program that had been running for 4 years under a series of shell names and redirected budgets. He'd spent 6 hours photographing key documents with a camera, pulling originals, and transferring files from the facility's local server to his portable drive. At approximately 6 a.m., around the same time I was burning toast, he'd heard the access door open above him. Footsteps. Multiple people. They'd gone to the lab section, not records. But Marcus had heard voices and recognized one of them. Garza. He brought 2 people with him, Marcus said. I don't know who they are. Private security, maybe. They were armed. They went straight to the lab and started moving equipment cases, containers, the same kind of sample storage I've seen at the other facility. He's not here to destroy evidence. He's here to relocate it. Relocate it where? Nora asked. I don't know. But he was on a satellite phone when he came down. I couldn't hear much, just fragments. Something about a transition protocol and a timeline that had moved up. Nora's face did something I hadn't seen before. The controlled mask slipped. And underneath it was not fear, but fury. Cold and precise, and held behind her teeth like a blade. He's running, she said. The outbreak is his exit strategy. He triggers the breach, lets the chaos provide cover, then moves the research assets to a private buyer. The program is over, but the pathogen isn't. And whoever has the samples and the data has a weapon no government agency will admit exists. Can you prove that? I asked. Marcus reached behind the barricade and pulled out a stack of documents held together with a binder clip. Signed memos, funding authorizations, communication logs between Garza and a defense contractor called Meridian Strategic, and 3 internal reports documenting the mutation acceleration, each one stamped with a recommendation to halt the project, each one overridden with Garza's signature. He handed the stack to Nora. She flipped through the pages with the speed of someone who already knew what she was looking for, stopped on one, read it twice, and nodded. This is enough. If we can get this to the right people, actual oversight, not the chain that authorized the project, we can prove the outbreak was deliberate and who's responsible. There's a problem with that, Whelan said from the doorway where he'd been watching the corridor. Getting it to anyone requires getting out of here, and Garza's people are between us and the exit. Marcus stood. He was unsteady dehydration, exhaustion, the accumulated toll of a night spent alone, underground, doing the most consequential work of his life, but his eyes were clear. His hands were steady. Whatever window Nora had described, whatever extended incubation the ambient exposure might grant, he was still inside it. There's a service tunnel, he said. Emergency egress, built into the original design. It runs from the administration section to a surface hatch about 200 yards from the main entrance, on the hillside above the lot. You've been through it? No, but I found the blueprints. He pulled a folded document from his back pocket, a facility schematic, creased and marked in pencil. The service tunnel was highlighted in yellow. It ran from a utility room in the administration wing, through a narrow passage, and emerged at a hatch marked with a small red circle on the surface above. It passes within 30 feet of the lab section, Nora said, tracing the route. If Garza's people are in the lab, they'll hear us in the tunnel. Depends on what they're doing in there, Marcus said. The lab has its own ventilation, heavy equipment. If they're running anything, the ambient noise should cover foot traffic in the tunnel. That's a lot of ifs, Whelan said. Every option is a lot of ifs, Marcus replied. The only guaranteed outcome right now is that if we stay here, Garza finishes his work and leaves, and we either follow him out into whatever he's left behind, or we stay underground until the supplies run out. He looked at me. Not at Nora, not at Whelan. At me. His older brother's gaze, the one that used to check whether I'd done my homework, whether I'd eaten, whether I was holding together after our father died, and I was 17 and didn't know what to do with my hands. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly. "I'm sorry. You left your keys in the truck and your phone dead on the seat. You're the worst covert operative in history." He didn't smile, but something behind his expression loosened. He picked up the tire iron, tucked the portable hard drive into his jacket, and nodded toward the door. We moved. The administration wing was quieter than Records Untouched, ordered, every door closed and every light functioning. It had the eerie stillness of a place that had been designed for daily use and then abandoned mid-sentence. Coffee cups on desks, a jacket draped over a chair, a calendar on one wall still showing October. Marcus led us to a utility room at the far end of the wing. The door was plain, unmarked, locked with a deadbolt that he opened with a key from the facility's master set, which he'd found in the administration office hours earlier. Behind the door, the room was small electrical panels, a water heater, shelving with maintenance supplies. On the back wall, a metal hatch was set low to the ground, about 3 feet square, secured with a wheel lock like a submarine bulkhead. Whelan turned the wheel. The hatch opened with a groan of disuse and a breath of stale, mineral-tasting air. Beyond it, a concrete tunnel extended into darkness, narrow, maybe 4 feet wide and 5 feet high, forcing us into a crouch. 200 yards, Marcus said. "Stay tight, stay quiet." Whelan went first with the rifle, then Nora with the hardshell case, then Marcus. I went last, pulling the hatch shut behind us but not sealing it. I didn't want to risk the noise of the wheel lock, and I didn't want to cut off our retreat. The tunnel was rough-poured concrete, no finished walls, conduit and pipes running along the ceiling at head height. The floor was damp. Our footsteps, no matter how careful, produced a flat, echoing slap that seemed to carry in both directions. Whelan moved with practiced silence, his boots finding the driest patches. The rest of us followed his path. We'd covered about 60 yards when the tunnel passed through a section where the wall on our left changed from concrete to metal, a shared partition with whatever space was on the other side. The lab. I could hear machinery through the wall, a hum, a rhythmic clicking, voices too muffled to parse, but present. Garza was 30 feet away, separated from us by a metal panel, and whatever mercy coincidence felt like granting. Marcus touched my shoulder and pointed ahead. Another 50 yards. The tunnel curved slightly to the right and began to climb. A set of metal rungs appeared on the wall, leading up to a hatch identical to the one we'd entered through. We were 10 feet from the ladder when the lights went out. Not just the tunnel lights, everything. The machinery sound from the lab cut off. The ventilation system that had been a constant, almost subliminal presence went silent. The darkness was absolute, the kind of black that has texture, that presses against your eyes and makes them invent shapes. I heard Whelan's flashlight click on, a narrow beam that cut the dark, then Nora's, then mine. 3 beams in a concrete tube, our breath suddenly audible, our heartbeats suddenly present. "Generator cut," Marcus whispered. "Main power and backup." "That doesn't happen by accident," Nora said. "No." A sound came from behind us, from the direction of the lab, metal on metal. A door opening, footsteps entering the tunnel. Then a voice, calm and conversational. amplified by the tunnel's acoustics into something that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Dr. Kessler, I can hear you breathing." "Garza." Nobody moved. The footsteps stopped, then resumed, closer. "I disabled the generator for a reason. The surface hatch runs on magnetic locks. No power, no release. You're welcome to climb the ladder and confirm this." Whelan angled his rifle down the tunnel. In the flashlight beam, I could see maybe 40 feet of empty passage before it curved out of sight. "I'd rather not have this conversation through a wall," Garza continued. "But I will if necessary. Here's what I want: the portable drive and the documents Marcus took from the records room. That's all. Give me those and you walk out the main entrance, all 4 of you." Marcus's hand found my arm in the dark. He squeezed once. "A signal we'd used since childhood. Sit tight. Don't react. Let me think." "You triggered the outbreak," Nora said. Her voice was steady, aimed down the tunnel like a weapon of its own. "You killed the containment and let the pathogen go live. People are dying right now because of what you did." "People were always going to die, Nora. That was the design specification. You wrote it." Silence, the kind that has mass. "The difference between us," Garza said, "is that I accepted what this project was from the beginning. You pretended it was research, pure science, plasticity mapping. You told yourself the applications were theoretical, and now you're carrying a case of samples through an escape tunnel because you still haven't decided whether you're a whistleblower or a war criminal." I heard Nora's breathing change shorter, tighter, and I understood what Garza was doing. He was buying time. He was keeping us talking while his people repositioned, or while he found another way to cut off the tunnel. "We move," I said, barely above a breath. "Ladder, now. We check the hatch ourselves." Whelan was already climbing. His boots rang on the rungs, echoing, and from down the tunnel I heard Garza's footsteps accelerate. Whelan reached the hatch, braced himself, and threw his weight against the wheel lock. It didn't turn. He tried again, both hands, the rifle slung across his back. The lock was frozen not mechanically, but electromagnetically. Garza was right. No power, no release. Marcus pushed past me and climbed up beside Whelan. He studied the hatch in the flashlight beam, then pulled a multi-tool from his pocket and began working at the edge of the panel where the magnetic lock housing was bolted to the frame. 2 minutes, he said. We didn't have 2 minutes. Garza's footsteps were getting closer, and now there were others with him, the heavier tread of armed escorts. I moved to the base of the ladder and aimed my flashlight down the tunnel, creating a wall of light that would blind anyone rounding the curve. A figure appeared at the edge of the beam. Not Garza, one of his security team. Armed, tactical gear. He raised a hand against the glare and stopped. 40 seconds, Marcus said above me. The security man lowered his hand and raised his weapon. 30, Marcus said. A sound came from behind the security man, from deeper in the tunnel, from the direction of the lab. A sound I recognized. The clicking. Rapid, insectile, layered. Not one throat. Many. The security man turned. His flashlight swept the tunnel behind him and found what the darkness had been concealing, the infected from the lab, the containment rooms, the facility that Garza had cut the power to without considering, or perhaps while deliberately calculating, that the magnetic locks on every door in the building had just released. I saw them in his beam for a fraction of a second. At least a dozen figures, pale, gowned, moving with that fluid, purposeful drift. The security man fired 3 shots, deafening in the tunnel, the muzzle flash lighting the walls in staccato bursts. Now, Marcus shouted. The hatch clanged open above us. He'd pried the lock housing free from the frame, and cold daylight poured into the tunnel like water. Whelan went through first, then Nora. Marcus grabbed my arm and pushed me toward the ladder. I climbed. Behind me, the tunnel filled with the sound of more gunfire, then screaming, then the clicking louder, closer, a chorus of broken voices producing a sound that was almost harmonic in its layered wrongness. Marcus was the last through the hatch. He slammed it shut and dropped onto the hillside beside me, breathing hard, his knuckles bloody from the pry job, his face white. Below us, through 6 inches of steel and concrete, the sounds continued. Then they stopped. The hillside was steep and wooded, and we half ran, half slid through dead leaves and loose soil toward the gravel lot below. The daylight was painful after the tunnel gray and flat, but still overwhelming. And my eyes took long seconds to adjust. The air smelled like pine and cold, and something underneath it I was learning to recognize. The faintly sweet, metallic scent that the uninfected carried. That seeped from their skin and their breath, and that lingered in any space they'd occupied. The lot came into view through the trees. Nora's Land Cruiser, my Subaru, the white van, Garza's black SUV, and beside the SUV, a man. He was leaning against the driver's door, arms crossed, watching us descend the hill with an expression of patient calculation. Mid-50s, clean-shaven, gray at the temples, wearing a dark overcoat that looked expensive and shoes that had no business being on gravel. He didn't look like someone standing in the middle of a collapse. He looked like someone waiting for a meeting to start. "That's Garza," Marcus said. He'd gotten out. While his security team dealt with what he'd unleashed in the tunnel, he'd walked out the front door. The man who'd triggered an outbreak, who'd come to retrieve his stolen evidence, who'd cut the power and opened every containment door in the facility, was standing in a parking lot, looking like he had a dinner reservation. Whelan raised his rifle. "Don't," Nora said. "He killed—" "I know what he did. And if you shoot him, he's the only casualty. We need him alive. He's the testimony. Without him, we have documents and samples, and the word of the woman who designed the pathogen. With him, we have the chain of command in a person." Whelan didn't lower the rifle, but he stopped advancing. Garza watched this exchange with interest. He uncrossed his arms and straightened up. "Pragmatic as ever, Nora," he said. His voice was softer in person than it had been in the tunnel, cultured, measured, the voice of someone who'd spent a career making catastrophic decisions in conference rooms. But pragmatism requires leverage, and right now your leverage is standing in a parking lot with one rifle and no extraction plan. "We have the drives," Marcus said. "We have the documents. You have copies and originals of material that was produced under a classified program designation. Material that, in the absence of the program's institutional context, reads as the product of a rogue research cell operating without authorization. You've removed that material from a secured facility. You've compromised classified assets. And you've done this with the assistance of the project's lead scientist, who, as the record will show, designed the core pathogen, and who has been under internal review for ethics violations since September." He delivered this with the calm of a man reading a legal brief. It wasn't a threat, it was a forecast. "They'll bury you," he said. "Both of you. The program will be disavowed. The outbreak will be attributed to a lab accident at a black market bioweapons facility run by a disgraced virologist and her accomplice. The containment response will be framed as federal intervention against a domestic bioterror event. And by the time anyone looks at those documents with critical eyes, the samples will be in a facility that doesn't appear on any government inventory. And I will be in a country that doesn't have an extradition treaty." The worst part was that he was probably right. I'd seen it before, not at this scale, but the mechanics were the same. The machine protects itself. The narrative is managed. The people who know the truth are reframed as the people who caused the problem. It had happened in every war I'd been part of. And it would happen here, in Missouri, on American soil, with American dead. Because the math of institutional survival is the same everywhere. Marcus looked at me. I saw the question in his face before he asked it. Is he right? I thought about it. Not the way you think about an abstraction, the way you think about a locked door when you're holding the only key and the room behind it is on fire. Maybe, I said, if the outbreak stays contained, if the story stays manageable, if the evidence stays physical. I looked at Garza. But we're past containment, aren't we? This isn't staying in Granton. The mutation rate, the transmission vector, the incubation window, this is going to spread. And when it does, the narrative won't hold. Because you can't classify a pandemic. Garza's expression didn't change. But his hands, the hands that had been loose and relaxed at his sides, curled slightly, just enough to notice. You're betting on catastrophe, he said. I'm observing one. From somewhere to the south, carried on the cold air like a rumor, came a sound. Emergency sirens. Multiple, continuous, growing. The outbreak was moving. Garza left. He got in the SUV and drove through the gate and turned south and disappeared into the gray distance, and we let him go because Nora was right. A dead Garza was a closed case, and a living Garza was a loose end that could be pulled until the whole structure unraveled. Whelan disagreed. He said so once, quietly, and then he accepted the decision with the discipline of someone who understood chain of command, even when it burned. We stood in the lot for maybe 2 minutes after the SUV's taillights vanished. 2 minutes of cold air and sirens, and the dawning comprehension that the world we'd left a few hours ago, the one with emergency broadcasts and shelter-in-place orders, had deteriorated into something that required new categories. Nora made the first move. She opened the Land Cruiser and pulled out a map paper. Physical, no signal required, and spread it across the hood. Her finger traced the route back toward Granton and then past it, southeast, toward the cluster of small towns that lined the river corridor. If the IGA cluster has migrated, Granton's main roads will be impassable. We need an alternate route to reach anyone with the authority and the infrastructure to receive what we've collected. Military? Marcus asked. National Guard. If the emergency alerts triggered the mobilization protocols, there should be a staging point within 50 miles, likely at the fairgrounds in Carver or the armory in Belden. That's through the river towns, Whelan said. If the infection has spread south, then every road is a risk, and we pick the least bad option. Marcus leaned against his truck. He'd been moving on will and adrenaline for 18 hours, and the debt was coming due. His face was gray. His hands trembled when he wasn't gripping something. But his mind was still tracking. I could see it in the way his eyes moved across the map. Calculating distance and terrain the way he calculated freight routes, finding the optimal path through a system of constraints. River Road through Millhaven, he said. It follows the bluffs. 1 lane in most places, no intersections, no population centers, until you hit the bridge at Belden. If the infection is spreading along the highways and through towns, the River Road will be clear because nobody uses it. Nora looked at me, a question without words. He's right, I said. I drove it as a kid. Our dad used to fish the bluffs. It's rough but passable. We divided into 2 vehicles, Marcus and I in the Subaru, Nora and Whelan in the Land Cruiser. Marcus argued that he should drive his own truck, but he could barely keep his eyes open, and I told him that if he wanted to fight about it, He'd have to do it sitting in the passenger seat with his seatbelt on. He slept within 4 minutes. Deep, involuntary, the kind of sleep that takes you like a tide. I drove and watched him and tried not to catalog the signs, the pallor, the sweat, or the faint tremor in his jaw. Nora had said the extended incubation window might give him more time. She hadn't said how much more. The river road was exactly as Marcus described, narrow, winding, cut into the bluffs above the water. The Missouri River was gray and swollen below, moving fast, indifferent to the catastrophe happening on its banks. I drove carefully, following Nora's taillights, and for 20 miles the road was empty. At Millhaven, a cluster of houses and a grain elevator on the riverbank, we saw the first signs of what the outbreak had become in the hours since we'd gone underground. A pickup truck was overturned in a ditch. A house was burning, slowly, smoke rising in a column that the wind bent south. On the road itself, a figure lay motionless, face down, in a dark spreading stain. And at the edge of town, where the road curved past the grain elevator, a crowd, not a crowd, a cluster, 20, maybe 30 infected, standing in the elevator's loading yard, motionless, oriented south, arranged in a loose formation that looked almost geometric. They weren't moving. They were waiting. For what, I didn't know, and I didn't want to find out. Nora's Land Cruiser slowed but didn't stop. She threaded past the elevator on the opposite side of the road, putting the full width of the gravel between us and the cluster, and I followed. One of the infected turned its head as we passed just the head, that terrible isolated rotation, but none of them moved. Marcus stirred beside me. "How many?" he murmured. 30. They're static. They cluster before they migrate. Density threshold. Once they hit critical mass, they'll move as a unit. Where did you learn that? Nora's research. The pathogen doesn't just suppress cognition, it creates rudimentary swarm behavior. The infected respond to each other's neurochemical output. They synchronize. It's not intelligence, it's emergence. He said this the way he said everything, clearly, precisely, with the organizational mind that had made him good at logistics and bad at small talk. Even now, even exhausted and potentially dying, he was filing information into categories, building a picture, making the chaos legible. "Marcus," I said, "are you infected?" He was quiet for a long time. The river road unwound ahead of us, gray and narrow and hugging the bluffs. "I don't know," he said. "I was in Building C before I went to the records facility. Nora had told me it was sealed, but the ventilation had been compromised. I was inside for maybe 10 minutes. I wore a mask. But the mask wasn't rated for aerosolized particulates, and the containment failure had already breached the air handling system. So there's a chance. There's a chance." I drove. The river moved below us. The sky pressed down. "If it happens," he said, "you take the drives and the documents. You get them to someone who can use them. Not a politician, not a news outlet. Someone with technical capacity, a university lab, a WHO office. Someone who can verify the research and understand what the pathogen is. Nora can guide you. You're going to guide me yourself." "Cal, you're going to guide me yourself, Marcus." He didn't answer, but he reached over and put his hand on my shoulder, and we drove in silence until the bridge at Belden appeared through the mist. The bridge was blocked, not by infected, by the living. A makeshift barricade of vehicles, furniture, and shipping pallets had been erected across the two-lane span, and behind it, a group of about 15 people stood with weapons ranging from hunting rifles to baseball bats. They'd seen us coming and had arranged themselves in a defensive line that looked improvised but determined. Nora stopped the Land Cruiser 50 yards from the barricade and got out with her hands visible. I did the same. Marcus stayed in the car. A man stepped forward from the group. Late 50s, heavy build, wearing a canvas coat and a John Deere cap. He had a shotgun broken open over his arm, a gesture of caution, but not aggression. "Bridge is closed," he said. "Town's closed. We've got 38 people on this side and whatever's out there on that side, and we aim to keep it that way." "We're not infected," Nora said. "We're trying to reach the National Guard armory on the east side of Belden." "Armory's empty. Guard mobilized 6 hours ago. Headed north toward Granton. They haven't come back and the radio's gone dead." Nora absorbed this without visible reaction. "Is there any communication with the outside? Any channel that's still working?" "Ham radio. Carl Dietrich has a setup at his house 2 blocks east. He's been picking up fragments, military, civilian, some kind of federal coordination channel. It's bad. The whole north end of the county is overrun. They're talking about a perimeter, but the perimeter keeps moving south." "We have critical information," Nora said. "Scientific data about the cause of the outbreak. We need to get it to someone with the authority to act on it." The man looked at her for a long time. His eyes moved to the Land Cruiser, to the Subaru, to Whelan's rifle, to the hard shell case Nora was carrying. He was making a calculation, the same kind of calculation everyone was making now. The math of trust in a world where trust had become a survival risk. "Carl's place," he said finally. 2 blocks east, the yellow house with the antenna. He'll let you use the radio. But the vehicles stay on this side of the barricade, and you come through on foot." We agreed. Marcus and I walked through a gap in the barricade together. His steps were steady but deliberate, each one placed with the concentration of someone walking a line they might not be able to walk again. Carl Dietrich was a retired electrical engineer with a ham radio setup that took up most of his living room. He was a small man with wire-rimmed glasses and an expression of focused intensity that hadn't been altered by the end of the world he'd been intense before. And the apocalypse, say, had merely given his intensity a context. Nora sat down at the radio and began transmitting. She used frequencies I didn't recognize, call signs that sounded institutional rather than amateur, and a coded phrasing that suggested she'd planned for this contingency. She transmitted for 11 minutes, repeating her message 3 times with slight variations, providing coordinates, file descriptions, pathogen characteristics, and the name Luis Garza. On the 4th attempt, someone answered. The voice was male, clipped, professional. It identified itself with a call sign and asked Nora to verify her identity. She gave a string of alphanumeric characters that I assumed were from her security clearance. The voice went silent for 2 minutes, then came back and asked her to stand by. We stood by. Marcus sat in Carl's recliner with his eyes closed. His breathing was even but shallow. I watched his hands. They were still. The voice returned and said 3 sentences that I will remember verbatim for the rest of my life. "Dr. Kessler, your identity is confirmed. A recovery team will be dispatched to your location within 4 hours. Secure all materials and personnel and do not move." Nora put down the handset. She looked at Marcus, then at me. Her face held no triumph, no relief, just the exhausted recognition that the next phase had begun, and that it would be harder than everything that had come before. 4 hours, she said. I looked at Marcus. His eyes were still closed. His hands were still. His breathing had changed slower now, deeper, with a faint rhythm that might have been sleep or might have been something else. I sat down beside him and waited. The 4 hours passed in the strange, compressed temporality of crisis, simultaneously endless and instant. Carl Dietrich made coffee. The man with the shotgun, whose name was Dale Purcell, organized a watch rotation on the barricade. Nora sat at the radio and monitored the federal channel, writing notes on a legal pad that grew denser with each transmission she intercepted. Whelan patrolled the perimeter of the town's defended zone with 2 local men who'd hunted these hills their whole lives and who understood sight lines and terrain in a way that military training often misses. Marcus slept for 2 of the 4 hours. When he woke, he was disoriented, his eyes unfocused, his first words garbled, and I felt something in my chest tighten like a fist. But he blinked, shook his head, looked at me, and said, "Coffee?" And the fist released, slightly. I brought him a cup. He held it with both hands and drank slowly, and didn't ask what time it was or how much longer we had. He looked at the papers on the table, the documents he'd pulled from the archive, the evidence that had cost him a night underground, and possibly more, and he nodded once, to himself, as if confirming that it had been worth it. "I need to tell you something," he said. I sat down. "I've been working with Nora for 14 months, since before Mom got sick. I found the manifests, traced the funding, confirmed what the facility was doing, and made the decision to help expose it. I didn't tell you because the information was classified, and because I knew that if you knew, you'd want in, and I didn't want you anywhere near this. You were protecting me. I was managing risk. You were the contingency. If something happened to me, you were the one person I trusted to pick up the thread. That's why I left the map open. That's why I brought you to Granton to clear out Mom's house that specific week. I needed you close in case the timeline accelerated." I stared at him. The realization settled slowly, like sediment in water. "You knew the outbreak was coming." "I knew it was possible. Nora's models showed that the mutation rate was approaching a threshold where containment failure was statistically likely within weeks. We didn't know it would be deliberate. We thought it would be an accident. But you came to Granton anyway. You brought me. I brought you because if the worst happened, I needed you to survive it. You're the one who adapts, Cal. You always have been. I plan. You adapt. That's how we're built." I wanted to be angry. I could feel the anger's shape in its edges, its heat, but when I reached for it, it dissolved into something more complicated. Gratitude, grief, the recognition that Marcus had been carrying a weight I couldn't have imagined, carrying it alone, carrying it with the same meticulous, obsessive discipline that he brought to everything. And that the cost of carrying it was sitting in front of me in the form of bloodshot eyes and trembling hands, and a question neither of us would speak aloud. "The drives and the documents," I said. "If they get to the right people, if the evidence holds, what changes?" "Everything or nothing. Depends on whether the system is capable of accountability or whether it's only capable of survival." "Which one do you think?" He looked at me. His eyes were clear. Whatever was happening inside his body, whatever biological clock was ticking, his mind was still his own. "I think you'll find out," he said. "And I think you'll make the right call when you do." A sound came from outside rotors, distant, approaching. The recovery team. Whelan appeared in the doorway and nodded. I helped Marcus to his feet. He leaned on me, and I took his weight. And we walked out of Carl Dietrich's yellow house into the gray afternoon, where a Black Hawk helicopter was descending into the field behind the church, and the future, whatever was left of it, was waiting for us to arrive. The helicopter's downdraft flattened the dead grass and sent papers scattering from Nora's legal pad. 2 soldiers in full hazmat gear stepped out and approached with the careful, procedural movements of people trained to handle exactly this kind of nightmare. They checked our IDs. They scanned us with handheld devices that beeped and displayed readings I couldn't see. When they scanned Marcus, one of them paused, looked at the readout, looked at his partner. "This one needs immediate containment protocol," he said. Not unkind, just factual. Marcus didn't flinch. He'd known, maybe for hours, maybe since Building C. He turned to me and held out the portable hard drive. "You take it from here." "Marcus, you take it from here, Cal." I took the drive. It was warm from his pocket, from his body heat, from the 14 months of quiet, solitary work that had led to this moment. He squeezed my hand once the same grip he'd used to teach me to hold a wrench when I was 8 years old. And then he let go and walked toward the soldiers with his hands at his sides and his back straight and his steps steady. And he did not look back. The helicopter took Marcus and Nora to a military medical facility whose location I wasn't given. Whelan and I were transported to a processing center near Jefferson City, where I was debriefed for 9 hours by people who alternated between treating me as a witness and treating me as a suspect. I gave them everything: the drives, the documents, Nora's samples, my account of the facility and the tunnel, and Garza's words in the parking lot. 3 weeks later, Marcus was still alive. Nora's antibody theory proved partially correct. The extended incubation gave the military virologists enough time to develop a stabilization protocol. Not a cure, but a way to halt the progression. He was conscious. He was communicating. He was still organizing information from his hospital bed, dictating memos to whoever would listen, building the case against Garza and the institutions that had funded the project. Garza was arrested at a private airfield in Kentucky, attempting to board a charter flight to Sao Paulo. The samples he'd taken from the facility were recovered. The investigation, when it finally became public, confirmed what the documents showed. The outbreak was the result of a deliberately engineered pathogen, developed under classified authorization, and released through an intentional containment breach designed to provide cover for the destruction of evidence. I don't know if the system is capable of accountability. Marcus asked me that question in Carl Dietrich's living room, and I still don't have the answer. What I know is that the evidence survived. The truth, documented and physical and undeniable, made it out of a concrete hole in the hills of Harlan County because my brother spent 14 months building a plan. And because when the plan fell apart, he adapted, and then he asked me to do the same. I keep the yellow legal pad note in my wallet. Marcus's handwriting. Bring Cal. 2 words that brought me into the worst thing I've ever lived through and the most important thing I've ever done. He planned, I adapted. That's how we're built. That's how we survived.